Everyone. Very welcome to our East Asia seminar series and jointly hosted here at the Monk School with Professor Philip Lipsy's Center for Study of Global Japan. This afternoon, we're really pleased to be presenting a panel to you on Korea and Japan relations and its implications for Canada. My name is Diana Fu. I'm a professor here at the Monk School, and I specialize in contemporary Chinese politics. And so I just wanted to provide a brief description of the panel, and then also wanted to let you guys know that we really want these events to be conversations as well. So we will be leaving at least 15 minutes at the end of the seminar for Q&A. So please get ready with your questions, and you can chat them at any time in using the chat function button at the bottom of your screen. So let me introduce our distinguished speakers today who will be talking about Japan and South Korea relations and its relationship to the United States as well as to Canada. First, we have Professor Andrew Yeol, who is a senior fellow and the SK Korea Foundation Chair at Brookings Institution's Center for Asia Policy Studies. He's also a professor of politics at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. I've known Andrew for a long time, and he's one of the most prolific scholars / think tankers that I know, because he's the author of or editor of 6 books. Now it is quite a feat to even write 1 or 2 books. He's the author and editor of 6 books, including State Society Markets in North Korea, Asia's Regional Architecture, and Activist Alliances and Anti-US Based Protests. So he's very well versed in this. We also have Professor Jennifer Lind, who's an associate professor of government at the University of Dartmouth. She's also a faculty associate at the Institute of Japanese Studies, Harvard University, and associate fellow at the U.S. and Americas program at Chatham House in London. And we also are joined by our very own Professor Philip Lipsy, who is a professor of political science here at the Monk School, where he also is the chair in Japanese politics and the director for the Center for the Study of Global Japan. He is also cross-appointed at the Faculty of Law and at the University of Tokyo. So without further ado, I just wanted to hand it over to our panelists for their opening remarks. And basically, we had a very simple question for them that has to do with the theme of this panel, which is, can Japan and South Korea actually partner together as leading Asian democracies as a counterweight to China, or is their relationship too fraught to do so? So over to you, Professor Jennifer Lind.
Thank you so much, Diana, and thanks to our audience for joining us on a Friday late afternoon instead of going off to happy hour. So we're delighted you made that choice. So we have lots of good things that we could point to, right? When it's a discussion of how are Japan-South Korea relations proceeding, can we expect increased cooperation between these countries? We've seen a lot of progress in recent years under Kishida and Yoon. We had the Camp David summit in 2023. We saw the countries restore the sharing of sensitive military intelligence. They resolved what had been a kind of aggravating trade dispute. And we've seen them increasingly engage in some joint military exercises, which, even just this month, and we're seeing that happen more frequently and along a variety of different domains with a variety of different kinds of military personnel and missions. So this is all good news for people who are really hoping that these two countries do more to cooperate in the Indo-Pacific. But that said, there are certainly many obstacles to deeper cooperation and to sustained cooperation. Obviously, the fact that we have a incoming new Trump administration is a really important matter to discuss. And I have a feeling we're going to be touching on that issue. So I'm going to leave that aside for the moment and come back to that, because I think that is definitely a factor. But I wanted to talk about 2 issues. One that we frequently hear raised that I actually don't think is the huge obstacle, namely the history issue. And then I want to lay out what I actually think is a bigger impediment to cooperation, which is kind of divergent threat perception between Japan and South Korea. So on the first point, many people say that the two countries are stymied in cooperating because of the history issue. So as it said, history gets in the way of closer cooperation. And by this, we're talking about, first of all, the violence committed by Japan on the Korean Peninsula in the early 20th century, which was, of course, terrible, right? So the South Koreans really, well, the Koreans in general have strong memories of that historical experience and the many people who suffered from it. Prominent issues include forced labor, so victims of forced labor who were sent from Korea to Japan, and then the abuse of the comfort women and girls who were forced into sexual slavery for the Japanese military. So these issues are very prominent when people think of the Japanese occupation of Korea during that early 20th century. The history issue also refers to the decades since the war. So during that time, frequently the South Korean leaders would pressure Japanese leaders to admit and atone for these issues. Frequently, Japanese leaders would make insensitive statements, or you would see a textbook in which the issue was ignored or referred to in a way that South Koreans found very upsetting. Often Japanese leaders perhaps would visit the controversial Yasukuni Shrine, right? So there are all these different types of history issues that would come up and would create a big downturn in relations. So that's what we mean when we talk about the history issue. And again, there's a view out there that says because of the way, so first of all, because of those atrocities, and then additionally, because of the way Japan has not adequately apologized for them, Japan and South Korea cannot move forward until they make progress on that historical issue, on historical reconciliation. And I actually see two problems with this very common view. So first, it glosses over the fact that Japan actually has apologized many, many times to South Korea. I think this actually gets to the issue of what do we think an apology is, right? And so many times people think an apology is one thing, and they have in their mind something that Japan should say and do, but they just use the word apology as a shorthand, and then the Japanese hear that and they say, well, wait a minute, we've already apologized, right? So,
Professor Lind, you're breaking up.
uh-oh. Hi.
At least I don't know if you were breaking up on the other end. The last I heard,
Okay.
okay, was it okay on everybody else's
I
end?
can hear it okay.
Is the picture okay, or what do you think?
It's-
I can also turn my photo off.
Issue. Yeah.
Okay. So where should I start?
Just exactly where you left off. The apology.
Okay. So again, it's the thought that Japan has not apologized, which when Japanese people hear that, they have in their heads all the many, many statements that Japanese leaders have given over the years and so on. And so I think there's kind of a disconnect in what South Koreans mean when they talk about what they want Japan to actually do or say, and what the Japanese leaders have done over the years. But basically, Japan has apologized, right? So to just say Japan should apologize is not a helpful statement that's going to encourage progress. It's actually making things worse by leading to what's called apology fatigue in Japan. And then the other problem with this view is that if you look at historical, or if you look at international reconciliation, and if you look at the role that apologies and other kind of gestures of contrition, as I would call it, if you look at the role of what they play in reconciliation, you see that this is actually not something that typically is necessary for reconciliation in most cases. So in other words, this argument that, oh, only when countries apologize and so on can you see reconciliation, that just doesn't match up with the prominent cases of reconciliation that we've seen. I mean, you don't need to look any further than the US-Japan reconciliation to see that. Another prominent case is the case of the French and West Germans after World War II, where after World War II, the French were deeply hostile to Germany, who of course had occupied France. But the strategic environment was such in the early 1950s that the Soviet threat was such a menace to both West Germany and France that the two countries decided, they had to ally in the context of the creation of NATO. And so we think of Germany as being this country that did so much atonement and so on. But importantly, Franco-German reconciliation predated that contrition that would occur later. So in this case, again, it was clear that what brought those countries together, as in the US-Japan case, but was not, oh, they had a big historical reconciliation with apologies and so on. It was actually that they had a big security threat and they realized they needed each other. So that brings me to the second point, which I see as the real obstacle between Japan and South Korea, which is they don't feel that shared sense of threat perception. And indeed, there's actually a significant divide in how they see the threat environment. Japan, of course, has a territorial dispute with China and has growing threat perception of China. Japan's allied with the United States, and that alliance has transformed over time. But basically, today, you can think of it as becoming an alliance aimed at the containment of China. And this is obviously really different than South Korea's situation. South Korea does not have a meaningful territorial dispute with China. China is its largest and most important economic partner. China is also a very important country when it comes to who, if anyone, has influence over North Korea. And also China is expected to have significant influence over any sort of eventual settlement on the Korean Peninsula. So South Koreans really see good relations with China as essential in their diplomacy. When it comes to the US alliance with South Korea, yes, South Korea is a US ally, but this alliance is not aimed at China, right? So we frequently talk about South Korea as a US ally, and that's very, very true. But Americans sometimes forget that alliance is not about China, and the South Koreans have constantly reminded us of that fact. It's an alliance that has always been about and continues to be about North Korea. For example, the US has been trying to limit China's advanced military technological capabilities with export controls on semiconductor-related technology. South Korea has just not agreed to participate in that. And that's a really kind of amazing thing, right? So to have that significant divergence among treaty allies. So this is really important context for understanding any sort of Japan-South Korea cooperation. Again, that highly disparate level of threat perception. We just don't see South Korea balancing against China. It's not in an alliance against China, or it's not in any of the regional minilateral security initiatives such as the Quad and so on that are aimed at China. And so until the two countries come together more in having greater shared threat perception in terms of China really representing a threat to the region, Chinese regional hegemony, representing something that they're both equally concerned about. I think we'll continue to see some difficulty in the bilateral cooperation between Japan and South Korea, and then also the trilateral cooperation with Washington. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
So we just heard a pretty realist analysis from Professor Lind on divergent strategic and risk perceptions. Professor Yeol, do you agree with that assessment? And also, what are some other drivers for collaboration or divergent non-collaboration?
Well, this is exciting because I think I have a different perspective. I would say if Jenny has the glass half empty perspective, perhaps mine's maybe the glass half full. I'm a little bit more optimistic. But before I begin, let me just thank you for and the Monk School for organizing this. Next year is the 60th anniversary of the Japan-South Korea relations, and the Monk School is getting out ahead and marking the anniversary early, perhaps, and what will be one of, I think, many events next year commemorating the normalization of South Korea-Japan relations. 60th anniversaries are a really big deal in Korea, so So congrats for you to putting this event together. Your opening question was about underlying historical, or it was about whether Japan and South Korea can partner together as leading Asian democracies to counterweight China, or is their relationship too fraught? So I think Jenny did a pretty good job uh, parsing out what the differences are between South Korea and Japan on perception of China. And I absolutely agree in that there are differences. It's a matter of how wide that gap is. And I think there's a little bit more nuance in there. But let me first say that I think we are actually past the point of this narrative of fraught or okay Japan relations. That's not to say that the relations may go haywire again, but I think President Yoon has worked really hard to try to improve South Korea-Japan relations early in his administration, and he made it a priority. Now, why did he do that? Because it wasn't a very popular decision domestically. And it's because President Yoon is really wanted to strengthen the U.S. South Korea alliance, and he wanted to advance South Korea's own Indo-Pacific strategy. But to be taken seriously as an Indo-Pacific player, it required improving ties with Japan. I mean, Japan is the country that coined the Indo-Pacific phrase. And if you don't have a good relationship with Japan, how can you be taken legitimately by other players? So that was a very important key step, I think, for President Yoon. And of course, this helped lay the diplomatic groundwork between Korea and Japan relations. And I'm not going to say it's just Yoon. Of course, there was Prime Minister Kishida's response, and behind the scenes, I think the United States was really championing or pushing the US, Japan, Korea trilateral relations. So we saw the rapid revival of the trilateral. And so with South Korea-Japan relations having steadily improved, I'd say public opinion is more favorable as well. I just checked the numbers on an EAI Genron survey. In 2020, there was only 16% of Koreans that had a favorable impression of Japan. It's still under 50% today, but it's gone from 16% to 41% in 2024. This past year, we've seen a record number of Korean tourists, more than 2 million visiting Japan. I think the exchange rate was probably helpful in that. But my point is that I think we have seen this market improvement in the last few years. And there is political will. There was some concern when leadership transitioned in Japan, but Prime Minister Ishiba and President Yoon have already met twice. They met last week for the second time on the sidelines of the APEC. And in their 50-minute conversation, both Ishiba and Yoon agreed to elevate bilateral ties to, quote, even higher levels in 2025. They've pledged to continue shuttle diplomacy during their talks. And they also agreed to formulate a united response when it comes to threats like North Korea. So definitely the political will is still there, even with new leadership in Japan. And so the last point about improved Korea-Japan relations, it's not just the bilateral relationship, but it's encased within other trilaterals, minilaterals. The Camp David summit that Jenny mentioned was, of course, a watershed moment. But even in the last 6 months, there's been over a dozen trilateral meetings at various levels between US, Japan, Korea. And this all positively reinforces the bilateral relationship. I think it's true that the Trump administration may not push trilateral engagement as hard as the Biden administration did, but even then, which we can probably get to later in the Q&A, there's reasons why I think even Trump would want to sustain this trilateral mechanism. And so I think that's where I might diverge a bit with Jenny's characterization for South Korea, at least with the current Yoon administration, because I do think that South Korea wants to do more within the region. We've seen this with the US, Japan, Korea trilateral. They actually tried to get into the Quad. When Yoon was in campaign mode, he had asked or suggested if South Korea can somehow be a part of Quad or a Quad Plus, but I think there are other members that weren't so keen in Korea coming in, but Korea is very keen in becoming a part of AUKUS Pillar 2, the Australia, UK, US trilateral. So there are definitely ways where I think South Korea wants to become engaged more in the Indo-Pacific. And of course, having a good relationship with Japan is important to that. But in terms of points of tension, for me, I think relations are going well right now, but as Jenny had mentioned, there are these historical tensions that underlie that bilateral relationship. And I think domestic politics is something to look out for because Yoon's popularity is very low. It's like 20%. When Korea has elections, if we see the arrival of the opposition, progressive Democratic Party, then I think we could see some more trouble. And this is where we have potential divergent views of China. I think Yoon is pretty hawkish on China. I think they're still more cautious than Japan. They're not as forward-leaning as Japan and seeing the China threat. But I do think he is suspicious of China. He has a bit of as other conservatives do, an anti-communist streak. So there is room for cooperation. But I think because of Korean domestic politics, there is half of the country who still think that we should sustain ties, particularly because of the economic relationship with China. They don't want to ruin that relationship with Beijing, and that's where there's more caution. So for the time being, I think we're Korea-Japan relations in a good place, but the foundations, and because of domestic politics, it is possible that could partially unravel. So with Jenny, and I agree with her to some extent, but I think I'm a little bit more optimistic than her about where Korea-Japan relations can head next.
Great. Well, we love divergent takes from our panelists. So over to you, Philip.
Yeah, well, thank you both for those really insightful remarks. And it's always great to have a little bit of disagreement to start things off. I'd like to remind the audience that if you have any questions, we will be answering those at the end. So feel free to submit those anytime during the conversation. I'd like to, sort of carry forward on the last point that Andrew was making, in terms of moving the relationship forward, and this is directed to both of you. Are there any specific areas you see as particularly promising areas for cooperation, particularly given that we're about to see a significant political transition in the United States, which might create turbulence in the international order? And of course, in the previous Trump administration, there were significant efforts of other countries to try to band together to defend the liberal international order and so forth. Do you see, these are the top priorities for Japan and Korea to try to keep on moving things forward, for example?
I can go ahead. So I mentioned that the history issue is not one that we should see as a significant obstacle, but I certainly want to qualify that as saying there are things that people on both sides can do to make it even less of an obstacle, right? So basically the way I look at the history issue is that leaders can make it into an obstacle, or they can kind of helpfully move it out of the picture, right? And so there is actually a lot of agency here on behalf of these folks. I think what we've seen, and Andrew was correct in saying, like, this is a really good moment between Japan and South Korea relations. So we have the kind of the highs and the lows, and we're at a good moment. And part of that is because leaders have been quite pragmatic about history issues, right? So South Korean leaders, again, the conservatives tend to be the ones that want to sort of look forward rather than back. And so that's something that's a very helpful thing to do. And then on the Japan side, when I was first writing about this issue, it was, basically it felt like a couple times a month there would be some headlines about, some really insensitive thing that a Japanese politician did, or a Yasukuni shrine visit and so on. And I think Japanese leaders have gotten a lot more kind of, I don't know, message discipline on this issue, right? They've realized that this is an issue that is harmful for Japan's foreign relations. And on the Japan side, I think they are very interested in cooperation with South Korea. And so I see them really improving on this dimension in terms of kind of not throwing hand grenades into the into the scenario. And so that's really helpful. And I think that has really helped us get to this place that we're at today. And then the other thing I would say, and I'd really be interested in Andrew's thoughts on this too, is even though there might be in the South Korean side particularly, and I would also reference Southeast Asian countries in this category, where there's this significant hesitancy to engage in what looks like kind of counter-China balancing activity, right? I mean, South Korea has clearly gotten past that to some extent, right? It's moved in a significant direction, as Andrew mentioned already, relative to the past. But I think are there kinds of ways that the two countries can cooperate that look kind of less like a counter-China balancing coalition? And so I think the technology cooperation is really fruitful in that regard. Scientific and technological cooperation in green energies, in kind of these emerging technologies like AI and quantum. There's all sorts of really interesting areas that, again, this helps move the two societies closer together and is kind of more politically acceptable as well.
Great, thanks. Andrew, over to you.
Thanks. I'll pick up where Jenny had left off in terms of where there's room for further cooperation. I mean, so if they have some divergence on China, at least on the North Korea issue, I think North Korea is the gift that keeps giving when it comes to helping Korea and Japan stay close together. And I'll just mention that in one of the meetings between Ishiba and Yoon, they spent a good chunk of the time talking about concerns related to North Korea-Russia relations. And so they were saying that they'll try to keep each other abreast of information, particularly if Russia is sharing any kind of technology to the North Koreans to improve their capabilities. There's a very strong joint statement between the two countries when there was a bilateral meeting between the foreign ministers when North Korea launched an intercontinental ballistic missile at the end of October. So there's always more ways to even strengthen cooperation further when it comes to North Korea issues. The big deliverable in the past year was that they're now sharing information real time, sort of radar information when missiles launch from North Korea. So certainly more steps on the North Korea front. And then in terms of security issues, I mean, this was more on the US, Japan, Korea trilateral, but in the latest readout between the three leaders, they mentioned that they're opposed to unilateral attempts to change the status quo in the waters of the Indo-Pacific, and they are opposed to unlawful maritime claims in the South China Sea. They don't name China by name, but I think they both recognize that there's concerns about the role China's playing in the maritime space. So increased maritime domain awareness, even between the two, the navies, or the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force and the ROK Navy, and then also the Coast Guard. I think underregulated illegal unregulated fishing. I think that's an issue for both countries, and so that's a place for cooperation. But then the other place where there's a lot of area for collaboration is on economic security and technology, as Jenny mentioned. I mean, both countries are leaders in places like quantum computing, artificial intelligence. Both have an interest in helping shape the regulatory space when it comes to the use of artificial intelligence. Both countries recognize that they're very trade dependent. They don't have a lot of natural resources, so critical minerals are really important. So I think finding ways to strengthen supply chains on critical minerals is another area for cooperation. So yeah, there's certainly a lot of room or potential for strengthening this bilateral relationship, as long as, I guess, domestic politics or some of the history issues don't sideline them from some of these practical issues that need addressing.
Great, thanks. You know, thinking back to the first Trump administration, given that we're going to have a rerun in a few months. Um, uh, are there any lessons that you see the countries having learned from their previous experience with the Trump administration? To some extent, I think the conventional wisdom is that Japan had a relatively smooth ride compared to other countries, and Korea perhaps less so. But do you see that as informing their preparations for the upcoming administration? What do you think some of the lessons learned have been from that experience?
Well, I'm unmuted, so maybe I'll go first. But um, there are reports that President Yoon hadn't played golf for 8 years, and he started picking up his clubs and his practicing, and that's certainly something he learned from Abe. No, I'm saying this half facetiously. That was actually a news headline. But I think for the past year, actually, people have been saying that the personal diplomacy is really important with President Trump, and of course, Abe was the master at that. And beyond just taking golf lessons, there are uh, Yoon and Trump. They're actually similar in some of their characteristics, the way they operate. They pick like President Yoon. He picked a lot of people around him that were loyal. And he operates in a way where he rewards loyalty. He listens to people that are close to him, but he sort of makes decisions on his own. And his demeanor, in some ways, a lot of Korean friends, scholars are saying that there are ways where they think Yoon and Trump could actually get along personally. So they're trying to find ways to work that to their advantage. But also, I think South Korea is going to be they're much better prepared this time in season two than season one of Trump. And in the first go, 8 years ago, South Korea was undergoing their own leadership transition. President Park Geun-hye was impeached. They didn't have a president. I mean, there's an interim president, and so they couldn't do the preparation work that Abe and some other world leaders were doing to try to understand or reach out to Trump personally. And they had a phone call, and apparently it went quite well. So it was a 12-minute phone call, and one of the things that Trump mentioned was he was hoping that they could work together on shipbuilding, cooperation on shipbuilding, and so there's certainly areas where South Korea they know that certain things that Trump wants. He's very transactional. And, yes, it's going to be a lot more difficult to work with maybe the US when you're going from a values-based diplomacy to one that's very transactional. But you can work that to their advantage. So they're trying to figure out things that Trump is interested in. So now shipbuilding. So a whole bunch of South Koreans are now like studying or looking at, how they can cooperate on defense industrial production with the United States on this front. LNG, gas, so gas and oil, what sort of deals can be made there? Of course, South Korea is still interested in clean energy, but they also know that Trump will probably bring back fossil fuels. So is there something that can be worked out on that front? So I think that's some of the lessons that South Koreans have learned from the first go with Trump. The personal diplomacy matters, that it's going to be transactional on things like tariffs or alliance burden sharing. He may bring that up. So last week, what was circulating on social media was, I think, the embassy or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they had a one-pager kind of explaining all the things that South Korea has contributed to in terms of the alliance, in terms of investments. So I think they've come more prepared this time around.
Great. Jenny, with Abe out of the picture, what do you think Japanese policy is going to look like on this?
Yeah, I think that the Japanese would look back to their season one of the Trump presidency and say, hey, we did a really good job with that. And so they, I mean, if we look back to what happened, the Japanese immediately went to work trying to learn more about Trump, learn about his family. Abe was a very early, I think, the first leader who rushed to Trump Tower to meet with the president-elect before he was even inaugurated, and they had a very nice meeting with Ivanka there, and solid gold golf club that the Japanese presented to Trump. And so again, golf being a big theme here. So so the Japanese thought really carefully about this. They knew that personal relationships are very important to Trump, and they worked to create a good relationship. And I think it really paid off in that first term. And so I think that they're thinking about how they can do that at this time. I'll say one thing which is kind of interesting, which is interesting to me, which is if you think about the differing treatment by the first Trump administration toward South Korea and Japan, it seems kind of curious, right? Because if you think about the countries I mean, who's doing more for its own defense? It's actually South Korea, right? So South Korea is primarily responsible for the defense of South Korea. It has the massive army. It trains regularly with the United States. It spends, I think it's 2.8% of its GDP on defense, which is a pretty respectable figure for a US ally, right? Many of our NATO allies still haven't even met that 2% floor, just created a huge problem for the defense of Europe, obviously. So South Korea actually is an ally that kind of bears its share of the burden, right? And it's interesting, as Andrew pointed out, the South Koreans are really trying to remind Trump of this, of all the various ways that they do that. Japan, on the other hand, historically, when Trump first took over, Japan had long time spent 1% of GDP on defense, which is just a staggeringly low level of effort for a country that lives next door to a superpower that has claims on some of its territory, right? That's just astounding. So Japan seems like it would be the one to get shouted at by Donald Trump rather than South Korea. And yet it was kind of the opposite, right? Where Trump was quite testy about South Korea. They negotiated the special measures agreement, the upkeep for US military forces in Korea. And even recently, Trump was heard making comments about like, oh, I would have gotten them to pay 10 times as much as what the Biden administration did. So this theme of kind of frustration at our South Korean allies seems to have continued. And we'll see if Japan is going to continue to have that kind of glowy relationship of the sun-soaked days at Mar-a-Lago that Trump and Abe enjoyed. But to me, it's always been somewhat of a peculiar thing for somebody who we do regard as transactional, where the country that's actually giving more is getting treated worse. So when I talk to South Koreans, I always urge them. I say, hey, stand up for yourselves. Remind the administration. We're pulling our share of the burden. The other thing that I would just point out is in terms of lessons learned from the presidency, taking a step back and asking what lessons can we all learn from Trump 1.0. And I remember at the time speaking to people in US embassies, US diplomacy in the region at that time, and the theme that they were expressing concerns about was this sense of neglect, right? It was a sense of the Trump administration just kind of neglecting what diplomats saw as being kind of the essential American helpfulness and kind of that glue in the relationship that in the past they viewed as being really important. And so in addition to this theme of, how are our bilateral relations going to change with both countries, there's this general anxiety that we might have about we've seen a lot of progress in the trilateral relationship, which has also, we think, helped the bilateral relationship. And is the US going to take a much more lackadaisical view toward that in a second Trump administration, or maybe they'll feel like they have good reasons to still be deeply engaged. I don't know what the answer is, but I think there is that danger given the Trump 1.0 lessons that we'll see kind of less activity in the region by Washington, and that probably is not moving us in a helpful direction.
Yeah, certainly bears watching. Diana, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I also wanted to remind the audience, we've got two questions, which I'll get to shortly, but please, we have like maybe 16 minutes left. So please send in your questions, especially for the students that are online. This is your chance to pose your question to our experts. So in the meantime, I just had one question, an additional question for you guys about China, because I heard both of you say that, well, maybe one of the areas of cooperation between Japan and South Korea should be on technology and green technology, but also on AI. And when I hear that, and Jennifer, you mentioned that that's perhaps less sort of controversial than some of the other kinds of cooperations. But when I hear those keywords like cooperation on AI and on tech, I think that Beijing sees those things as extremely sensitive, extremely tied to security, and that they would be threatened by this kind of intense or increased cooperation on these fronts, even though it's not state-to-state cooperation, it's cooperation between, corporations or scientists or people to people. And so I'm wondering, what do you see as Beijing's moves, both in the past and maybe in the future, of retaliating against this kind of cooperation over technology? So maybe we'll go to Jennifer first, since I think you were first to mention that kind of issue as one of cooperation.
Well, I mean, AI is such a vast term, right? It's such a vast set of activities. You can train AI models to do a whole variety of things, right? You can train AI models to go through millions of photographs of, eye images and looking for signs of kind of retinal cancer, right? And so there's vast medicinal and health issues. So just to point out, like, that's one area that I don't think anybody would say, oh my goodness, this looks like the emergence of a counter-hegemonic bloc, right? You're right in that there are obviously huge military applications for AI, but we know that these countries are already cooperating all the time in the private sector. Even China and the US and China and these other countries are cooperating all the time in the private sector, right? So Silicon Valley is filled with research institutes by Chinese firms cooperating in AI. And so this is all still going on. And I think a lot of that activity is and would be seen at the kind of more non-governmental kinds of activities. You're absolutely right that there could be projects, like specific military projects, that all of these countries might want to cooperate on. And if Beijing knew about them, it might not like that a whole lot. But when it comes to retaliation, I'm not sure that that would be a particularly helpful thing. I mean, one thing we have learned about US export controls as a weapon, for example, is the many ways in which that actually harms yourself, right? It harms your own firms, it harms their profitability, it harms their R&D budgets, and so that's a really thorny direction for Beijing to go.
Yeah, Diana, I think on the AI cooperation, it's, as Jenny mentioned, it covers a wide range of issues. So if we're thinking along the lines of something like healthcare or education, what are best practices, or research and development, I mean, that's not something that would uh, send alarm bells to Beijing. I think when you start talking about AI, the use of autonomous weapons and their applications in the military domain, yes, then that kind of AI cooperation revolves around the same set of um, goals that, the Jake Sullivan small yard high fence, where you're trying to restrict technology from getting into the hands of the Chinese. I think that kind of cooperation may set up more of an adversarial relationship between China and the US and its allies. And so when we say room for cooperation, it's probably all of those things. I do think that the United States may be sensitive though on AI, because there's concerns even with I can't speak so much for the Japanese self-defense force, but even with the Korean military, there are things that the US may not want to share because they're not persuaded that the technology or the information that they share to South Koreans won't somehow get leaked. So I know this is not about US, Japan, Korea, but going back to the AUKUS Pillar 2, Korea is very keen in participating in that, but because Korea is not a member of the Five Eyes, where they share intelligence, where there's like a deep level of sharing of information and intelligence, um, I think the US and others have told South Koreans you need to beef up your cyber security and your defense before we can begin talking about cooperation. Um, and then there's also AI when it comes to the regulatory space. So South Korea was co-sponsor, I think, with the Netherlands on the REAM conference, so the regulatory AI in the military domain. And I think that's something where even the Chinese have some interest as well too, because they want to have their input shared as well. So as we're trying to figure out what the regulatory space looks like for AI, even in the military domain, I mean, China wants to make sure that they understand what the trends are, where the norms are heading, what is possible and what's not possible. And so because this is all being set up in the early stage, I think China is in on that conversation. So all this to say is that yeah, there is room for cooperation. In some things China may not be so alarmed, but in other cases they may be. And while I have the floor, I if could I have like 2 minutes just to respond to something that Jenny had said, which I thought was fascinating about how South Korea has been picked on a lot more by Trump in the past than Japan, even though they have the higher burden share. And Koreans have said that it goes back, it's really personal that sometime in the 80s or the 90s, Trump tried to make an investment deal in South Korea that went bad. And since then, he's really had it against the Koreans. Um, and so they said that he's really had this kind of negative impression of South Korea since then. And I think that's why I think the current administration is trying to work doubly hard to get on his good side to sort of change the narrative for what South Korea um, is about on Trump. But yeah, I think the on tariffs and alliance burden sharing across the board, I think that may be an issue for many alliances. Somehow Japan, again, could it be the Abe factor, was somehow they avoided a lot of the ire of Trump relative to other allies. But yeah, it was an interesting point I thought that Jenny had brought out. But I do think that this also speaks to the personal nature that the personal kind of views that Trump has in his own worldview and how that also shapes diplomatic relations.
Right, maybe Yoon could take a note from Abe on in terms of presenting gold. Was it solid gold clubs that you mentioned, Jennifer? That seems like that might have some impact on Trump's narrative of Korea.
Unfortunately, the issue though is Yoon tried to get a meeting with Trump, so he was just out at the APEC meeting. Andrew mentioned earlier that the three countries met on the sidelines of that. So again, a great sign of trilateral communication and so on. But Yoon also he had kind of a flexible schedule going back because he was going to try and see if he could get a meeting with Trump.
Yeah.
And apparently he was told like, oh, there are these US laws that prevent them from meeting with foreign leaders. And it's like, wait a minute. Why are we invoking those now? And we didn't worry about those last time. So I don't know, not a good sign for you. And that I don't know if
Yeah,
he
there was
came
an
with a
effort
golf club in hand, but
To stop by Mar-a-Lago on the way to the APEC meeting, but it didn't pan out for whatever.
yeah.
I believe the same was true for Ishiba, though. According to Japanese reports, they tried to get a similar meeting and they were turned down for the
Not a
same
good sign.
rationale. Yeah, yeah.
So we've got three questions. I'm actually going to ask them all at once so that you guys can pick and choose. And again, I encourage more students to ask. I encourage women to ask questions. So we've got one. I mean, the first two questions are around this historical question. So maybe I'll pitch that to Jennifer. So the question has to do with I think Andrew mentioned in his opening remarks about that there's like the positive perception of Koreans towards Japan has jumped quite a bit in the past few years, but there are still a significant number of people who have negative feelings towards Japan. And so the question is, what do they want Japan to do? Because you mentioned there's already apology fatigue. So what do they want? Like, what would satisfy the public? And then the second question is kind of similar in that, next year will mark the 80th anniversary of World War II. There's probably, this is going to be a milestone in terms of people who actually experienced World War II, and this could be said of China too. And so how do you foresee Japan and South Korean politicians, and I would add Chinese politicians, commemorating this anniversary? So those two questions go to Jennifer, and then the last question will go to Andrew, which is Trump has prompted a lot of fear of abandonment in South Korea and to some extent in Japan, and that's led to talk about the nuclear option. Do you see nuclear weapons development as a possible realm for Korea, Japan cooperation? So let's start with Jennifer and then go to Andrew and see if we can get a few more questions.
Yeah, these are really interesting. On the first question of what do they want Japan to do? I mean, it might be that there are people who are worried about entrapment in the region, and so they're not in favor of joining like a counter-China coalition just because they're worried about that the national security, right? So, and they don't see that as in the country's national interest. So maybe that's being expressed in that poll. But if we are talking about historical issues, I think this really is a fascinating issue because I just routinely speak to very learned people in South Korea who say Japan has never apologized. And I say, I don't know what you mean by that, right? And then I start rattling off all the speeches and the statements and the many times. And so there clearly is a disconnect there. And I say, oh, what about this statement? What about this statement? And then they frequently will say, I don't think Japan was sincere. And then they'll point out, a statement that some other Japanese leader made. Or they will say, oh, well, I want to see them get down on their knees like Willy Brandt did at the Warsaw Ghetto, and only then will I be satisfied. And so in response to that, I wrote my book on this issue, and so I thought a lot about how countries reconcile. And I just point out, the real outlier in this whole conversation is Germany. Countries just don't behave this way, right? Like so it's not remotely puzzling that Japan has people who routinely kind of gloss over past atrocities. That's not puzzling. Every country has that, including the United States, including Canada, right? Including South Korea. That's not puzzling at all. What is puzzling is Germany's kind of astounding level of atonement. Like nobody does that, right? And so it's odd for South Korea to say, why aren't you doing that kind of astounding, completely historically unique thing that the Germans did? And so I think in that context, it's sort of less puzzling when we look at Japan's behavior. But that said, I don't know how satisfying an answer that is to South Koreans. But I'll just also note that in a democracy with free speech, you can't tell people that they're not allowed to stand up and give their interpretations of the past, right? And sometimes those interpretations will be offensive to South Koreans, right? I mean, in the United States, you see statements made by Republicans, and the Democrats all get very offended and talk about how outrageous those statements are. And that's what democracy is the right to air those views. So I guess that's my way of saying I just don't think there's any silver bullet out there, like the kind of magic formulation of the apology that Japan has yet not said, or the magic gesture, right? I just don't think that exists. And so the argument that, oh, if they only did that, we would be fine, I just don't think that's reasonable. On the 80th anniversary question,
Jennifer, just if I
Yeah.
might, we just got another question I think really pushes a little bit on this question a bit more.
Uh-huh.
Does the sentiment of apologies not being genuine come from the textbooks in Japanese textbooks denying the history of war crimes, and that's a huge issue for the relationship between China and Japan, and caused and was the trigger for anti-Japanese nationalist protests about 10 years ago, and continues to be an issue. And I know you said that Germany is an outlier in terms of what it's done, but it, not having your textbooks recognize war crimes, is that sort of contributing to the perception of lack of genuineness?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, that's just factually not true. That I mean, when textbooks hit the headlines about there's a textbook that some people in Korea found offensive, for example, one time that was referring to a textbook used in one school in all of Japan. And so the first question to ask is what is the state of textbooks in Japan? And do we actually think that there's significant covering up of the past that's going on, right? And my understanding is this is a market where you're allowed to write whatever you want in the textbooks, and then those are submitted to the government, and they're only rejected by the government if they are factually inaccurate. So so the government doesn't tell you you have to put this stuff in there, right? So it's a system where the government has shifted to that to try and avoid these kinds of problems. And it's one in which schools have the freedom to choose textbooks that are more critical of Japan or less critical of Japan. And if the issue is about China, I mean, it's one thing to talk about South Korea, and I totally respect that as a democracy, uh, they have the right to ask Japan to have this conversation and so on. But I mean, if we're talking about China, what the heck are we talking about, right? Like an authoritarian country that routinely just relies on incredibly anti-Japanese propaganda. I mean, they have no ground to stand on to have a conversation about like, oh, your history is not full and complete, right? So that's just kind of, we're not interested in having that conversation with an authoritarian government that relies on so much anti-Japanese propaganda.
Okay, and I'm gonna have to cut you off on that one because we have 2 minutes for Andrew to answer the question about nukes.
Sure. And I see it's from Dan Snyder, whose work I also follow and read and respect greatly. So, um, and I'm sure he has thoughts as well. But when it comes to nuclear cooperation between Korea and Japan, I mean, I'm pretty skeptical, largely because Japan is pretty far behind on where they're at when it comes to developing nuclear capabilities. There's then the separate question about South Korea, whether they would be emboldened to develop their own indigenous weapons. And again, even there, I feel like there'd be a lot of diplomatic costs and risks to developing one's own nuclear weapons. But the key thing is really what the US and what the Trump administration does with this idea of extended deterrence. That is, US nuclear weapons are supposed to protect Korea and Japan. They're providing the nuclear umbrella. If Trump suddenly says that we're no longer going to do that, but North Korea still has weapons, South Korea needs a deterrent. And frankly, Japan would need a deterrent as well too. I think in that scenario that there could be, if it were that blatant, where Trump just says we're no longer going to protect these two countries with our nuclear weapons, then yeah, there will be some conversations. There could be a possibility of cooperation on that front. But I think even for the United States, though, and for Trump, I don't see what the rationale would be to suddenly deny its allies that kind of protective cover. So yeah, so I think we're pretty far. It's not out of the realm of possibility, but I think we're pretty far removed from that scenario at this point.
Great.
Can I comment on this, or are we out of time?
Maybe last word.
Yeah, I would just say I don't think we need Trump to raise this as an issue, because this already is an issue because of North Korea's development of an intercontinental ballistic missile capability. So now the costs of retaliating on South Korea's behalf have gone up exponentially for the United States. And that's a real shift in the security environment that I think is partly fueling South Korea's concerns. And so obviously here, I think Andrew's totally right. If Trump did suddenly announce a change in policy, of course that would ignite a big discussion about this. But I think we're already in a big discussion about this, at least in South Korea. I think Andrew's right that with Japan, they're not remotely as far down the path. But this is really a big issue in the US ROK alliance. And it's not because of Trump. It's because of this dramatically increased cost of defending South Korea that the United States now faces.
Well, with that, I just want to thank again our panelists for such a stimulating conversation. And I want to thank you for joining us at the end of term for the East Asian Seminar Series jointly hosted with the Center for Global Japan. Please stay tuned to our YouTube channel, The Monk School, and also stay tuned to our newsletters for our forthcoming events in the winter. And I wish you guys all a good end of term. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.